The room had been empty for decades, yet the air still felt shaped by the moment everything inside it stopped. Dusk clung to the stale light like a quiet surrender, and the long-dried scent of old plaster drifted through the narrow space where the investigation once lived and then stalled. For exactly 100 words, the scene clings to a stillness that feels deliberate, as though time itself had leaned in and stayed. And when the door groaned open again, the slow, hollow echo traced every bruise the years had left on this abandoned room. It was not welcoming, it was remembering. Detective Rowan Hale stepped inside, letting the cold breath of the forgotten scene settle into his coat. He didn't disturb anything at first. He only looked, the way a person looks at a place where they once failed. The evidence boxes, the pinned photographs, the taped outlines on the floor, everything waited like patient ghosts. He set the file he carried onto a metal table scarred by age and instinctively wiped the dust from a corner before opening it. The victim's name, once spoken with urgency and disbelief, sat quietly on the top of the first page. Mira Elling, age 26, graduate student, amateur photographer, lived alone near the edge of Cedar Brook, a small suburban stretch outside Salt Lake City. Found in her home on a winter morning in 1973, seen cold, no signs of struggle, life ended long before help was summoned. A case that had stirred anxiety but not resolution. A story that started cleanly and faded into doubt. Rowan traced the typed lines with a familiar tightness in his chest. He had not worked the original case. He had been a child then, but the silence in the file felt like inherited failure. Utah's cold cases had a way of settling into the bones of new investigators, as if demanding repayment for something lost. Myra's photographs, found scattered across her small living room floor, had been cataloged but never examined with depth. Most were simple: landscapes, portraits of fellow students, odd shots of empty streets. Her last roll, however, ended mid-frame, a blur of motion and light. It had meant nothing to investigators then. Film anomalies were common. But Rowan lingered on it now, studying the half-shaped curves of shadow. The original report described the scene as undisturbed. Nothing broken. No signs of forced entry. Her hands rested near her sides, not defensive. The heater had been off despite the cold. Whoever was with her had stayed long enough for the air to fall still. Rowan inhaled, sensing the faint remnants of old dust, dry wood, and something else, like papers that had been left untouched too long. He pressed a finger lightly to the edge of a different photograph, the last taken of Myra in life, showing her outside her home, smiling faintly at something off-camera. Unresolved lines in the image hinted at a story no one had cared to ask. He stepped carefully around the chalk outline preserved on a laminated floor map. He moved like someone afraid to disrupt a fragile memory. Each footfall carried weight, not from fear, but from the responsibility of returning to a place where answers had once refused to surface. With muted eyes, he passed his flashlight over the walls, where faint marks still showed where police tape had once been. The tape was gone now, but the adhesive stains remained, like shadows refusing to let go. Rowan's breath fogged faintly in the dim light, and for a moment he imagined Myra's final hours. The quiet house, the slow drop of temperature, the way silence might have settled long before she did. He folded the file slowly, careful not to crease the aging paper. "Mira Elling," he whispered, not expecting an answer. It wasn't a conversation, it was recognition. Some cases begin with noise. This one began with absence. Yet the room, untouched for years, had already started to stir. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The call had come 3 days earlier, short and hesitant, from a records clerk whose voice carried a mix of surprise and unease. A misfiled item. A box mistakenly sealed under a different case. something that should not have existed, yet did. Rowan had listened in silence, tracking each word with the measured calm that came from years of deciphering the unexpected. When he arrived at the archives, the clerk led him to a metal shelf, lower left corner, where a reddish cardboard container sat with a faded label. The number on the box did not match Myra's case, yet the clerk swore the contents inside belonged to her file. Rowan lifted the lid, the stale air slipping out like a long-held breath. Inside lay a single envelope, brittle at the edges, sealed with an outdated evidence tag. The handwriting, black ink, slight tilt, careful strokes, read, recovered from residence, unprocessed. He felt a controlled surprise ripple through him, one of those quiet, internal shifts that never touched the face. How had this gone unlogged? Who had missed it? Why had it been sealed away? Back in the old crime scene, Rowan now held that same envelope between two gloved fingers. The weight was negligible, but significance was heavier than anything he had lifted from this case before. He slit the seal with a small blade, letting its contents slide gently onto the metal table. A Polaroid photograph slid out first. It showed Myra's living room, same as the documented scene, but taken from a different angle, one not found in the official reports. And at the far edge of the frame, almost swallowed by shadow, stood a figure. Not fully captured, only part of a sleeve, a wrist, and a hand resting on the back of Myra's chair. Rowan's pulse didn't spike, but his attention sharpened with forensic precision. The room she had been found in, the exact chair where she had last sat, someone had taken this picture while she was alive. He flipped the photograph. A date in faded ink, December 3, 1973. The night before she was found. He let the realization settle, not dramatic, just factual and heavy. Next came a small strip of audio tape, its reel slightly bent. Beside it, a typed page containing a partial transcription. Most of the words were smudged, some unreadable, but a few stood out. Don't stay long. Not safe. Someone watching. Rowan lowered the page, letting the dust motes drift across its surface. This was not nothing. This was not misfiled debris. This was a shift. He cataloged each detail mentally. The angle of the photo, the timestamp, the unknown figure, the tone suggested by the transcription. Nothing sensational, just methodical redirection. He replayed the tape on an old portable machine the department still kept for aging evidence. Static filled the room in rough waves, followed by a faint, strained voice. Myra's voice, soft, hesitant, layered with a tension she tried to mask. Rowan leaned closer, listening for nuance. You didn't have to come back. Static. A man's voice, lower, harder to decipher. I needed to see it. More static. Then a brief scrape, like a chair moving. Then Myra again. Not safe tonight. The tape ended abruptly. Rowan switched the machine off. The silence that followed felt deliberate. This new evidence didn't provide clarity. It provided movement, a shift from stagnant archives to the brittle threshold of forgotten truth. And in the logic of old cases, movement mattered more than revelation. He placed the tape, photo, and transcript back in order, each item returned to calculated position. He understood what reopening meant, revisiting errors, untangling assumptions, listening to a voice that had waited 50 years to be heard. The room felt different now, less forgotten, more alert. Rowan exhaled slowly, aware that he had just stepped into the first real moment of progress since Mira Elling's name entered official records. Nothing about this was accidental. Investigator examines past reports to identify overlooked details. Rowan settled into the small metal chair that had weathered more cases than most detectives. He opened the original binder containing every report from 1973, its pages yellowed and thin. He turned them carefully, as though touching skin rather than paper. The initial officer's notes were brief, almost sterile. No forced entry, victim found near window, temperature low, no visible struggle, straightforward. Too straightforward. Rowan read between the lines what wasn't written mattered. He paused on a line, living room window slightly open. In winter, in a home with no evidence of tampering, investigators then had assumed the draft had been left by Mira herself. Rowan doubted it. Another page, interviews with neighbors. Most reported nothing unusual except one. A Mrs. Caroline Hask, elderly at the time, living 2 houses down. Her statement mentioned seeing a dark car parked near Mira's home for several nights before. Why had that not been traced further? No license noted, no follow-up. Rowan jotted a small notation in the margin. Facts forgotten could still speak. He turned to the inventory of Mira's belongings. One item stood out, a missing notebook. Not a journal according to her acquaintances, but a collection of location notes, schedules for photography shoots, and details of people she was documenting for a graduate project. It had never been found. In silence, Rowan stared at the space where the item should have been catalogued. If the notebook had contained schedules, it also contained names. Names of people she met, possibly someone in the Polaroid's shadow. He reviewed her last photography submissions. Landscapes, yes, but also something else. A series of shots focusing on an old industrial building outside town, the abandoned rail depot. According to the last progress note from her professor, she had visited that site repeatedly in the month before her death. He flipped through the photos, broken windows, rusted tracks, puddles of thin winter light. In one faint but present, a silhouette stood at the far end of the platform. Mira hadn't noted it. Investigators hadn't highlighted it. But Rowan saw it instantly. The stance, the angle, the blurred shape matching the position of the figure seen in the Polaroid. A connection, not dramatic, just logical. He continued reading. A paramedic statement mentioned something odd. Mira's heater switch had been turned off manually. Investigators dismissed it, perhaps she had been warm earlier. But with the window open, unlikely. Another detail. A neighbor reported hearing a soft knock around midnight the night before the body was found. Investigators noted it but didn't follow up because the time didn't align cleanly with the presumed death window. Rowan considered that assumption flawed. Presumed windows were often wrong. He cross-referenced timelines. Mira's last known conversation had been with her classmate who claimed they spoke briefly outside campus. She seemed anxious, looking behind her a lot. That detail, buried in a stack of interview papers, now pulsed with meaning. Rowan leaned back, eyes closing briefly, not in fatigue but in concentration. The cold air pressed lightly against his face. The scent of dust felt heavier now, as though the case itself exhaled with every discovery. He reopened his eyes and studied the Polaroid again. The hand, the sleeve, a pattern on the cuff, 3 narrow stripes, not decorative, functional like workwear. He mentally cataloged the people in Mira's circle who worked industrial or manual jobs. Very few. Rowan lifted the audio transcription once more. The words "not safe" lingered. He didn't dramatize the realization. He simply let it settle like a quiet correction of a long-held error. There were details all along, not loud, not wild, just overlooked. And logic was beginning to form its structure. The reopened file gave Rowan a direction, but direction alone was not movement. He needed people, faces, names, quiet histories that still cast shadows across the years. Every case of this age felt like trying to read handwriting exposed too long to weather. But he began anyway, organizing the list with the slow precision of someone rebuilding an abandoned structure from a few remaining beams. There were 4 individuals whose paths had intersected with Mira Elling in the weeks before her death. None had been seriously considered at the time, but each left a silent thread hanging. Rowan arranged their files on the table, each one placed at an equal distance, as though he wanted no early bias from their proximity. The first name belonged to Jonas Riddell, 28 in 1973, a part-time mechanic and former classmate. Their acquaintance had been casual, marked by brief conversations outside the university's arts building. The original report listed him as friendly, sometimes overly so. Interview notes from a young officer mentioned that Jonas had stopped by Myra's house twice in the month before she died, offering to help repair a faulty camera. His alibi the night she was last seen alive, home alone, working late on tools. No verification, no follow-up. A subtle detail in his file caught Rowan's attention. Jonas had been employed briefly at the old rail depot years before it closed, a place Myra had photographed, a location with a partial silhouette that resembled the figure in the Polaroid. Rowan added a small pencil dot beside the man's name, not suspicion, just a marker of possible relevance. Next was Lydia Marr, Myra's closest colleague in the graduate program. Intelligent, quiet, meticulous. The report described her as protective of her work. There had been whispers, nothing confirmed, about tension between the 2 women over a research project. Myra had received departmental praise for her photography. Lydia's work, equally dedicated, had not. Their final documented interaction took place 2 days before Myra's death, involving what a classmate described as a disagreement in low voices. The content of the disagreement remained unknown. Lydia's alibi, attending an evening gathering with multiple students. That alibi had been accepted quickly, perhaps too quickly. Rowan studied their photographs, 2 young women standing in opposite corners of a group shot, both with tight smiles, neither looking at the other. He noted Lydia's name carefully, not as a suspect, but as someone whose silence might contain its own motive. Third on the list was Evan Halter, the landlord, a practical man in his 40s, responsible for maintaining the small row of houses where Myra lived. He had keys to every unit. The original officer documented his presence near the property frequently due to ongoing heating issues, a detail that suddenly mattered now that Rowan knew Myra's heater had been turned off manually. Evan's alibi was the simplest. He claimed he had been out of town for 2 days for a supply pickup. Yet the timestamp on the rental truck receipt placed him returning the morning before Myra was found. No record confirmed where he had been between that morning and the next day. He had been dismissed at the time because he appeared calm, helpful, and cooperative. Rowan, now reading those words, felt a faint internal shift. Calmness was not clearance. The 4th file belonged to Calder Finch, a lecturer connected to the photography department. Myra had worked on a documentary project for his research initiative. Students described him as dedicated, absent-minded, occasionally intense. The original report only included his name because he had been one of the last people Myra spoke to. He had encouraged her industrial photography project. His alibi was solid. He had been hosting a late-night seminar. Rowan wasn't entirely satisfied. Alibis with many witnesses often concealed smaller gaps. He reviewed all 4 names again. Their motives, small tensions, private frustrations, overlapping schedules were not dramatic, but they didn't need to be. Small fractures in human interactions often led to larger consequences, and the tone in Myra's tape, the warning she tried to voice, had not been directed at some distant danger. It had been personal. Rowan pressed his finger lightly along the edge of the Polaroid once more. The hand in the frame, the sleeve, the shape. He imagined each suspect's stance, their posture, their history with workwear or industrial materials. Nothing conclusive yet. But their stories, once separate, now formed a pattern of intersecting paths. Rowan sat still for a moment. The dust in the air moved slowly, drifting through the thin beam of his flashlight. The silence around him steadied his thoughts, not as comfort, but as structure. The suspects were not loud. They did not stand out. They simply existed in the margins where truth often hid. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. Rowan began with the heater detail, small, easily overlooked but grounded in logic. Mira had been found in a cold room, the heater turned off. If she was with someone that night, they might have wanted the room quiet, still, temperature falling to mask something. But why turn it off? Why leave the window open? Rowan considered the possibility, control of environment. Someone needed the room to feel a certain way. Someone familiar with her habits, aware of her routines. He moved next to the window notation. Slightly open. In December. Cold nights in Utah did not invite open windows. Rowan examined photos from the original scene, searching for any sign of frost patterns or displaced items. Something subtle caught his eye. A faint, thin smear on the window frame, barely visible in the old monochrome prints. A possible glove mark. Or perhaps the residue of someone steadying themselves while entering or leaving. He shifted to the interviews compiled shortly after the discovery of Mira's body. Students described her as distracted, unsettled, nervous without saying why. A few classmates noted she had started leaving campus quickly after classes, no longer lingering for conversations. One mentioned seeing her looking over her shoulder repeatedly as she walked to the parking area. Emotion beneath the surface, not fear in the dramatic sense, just a quiet unease. Rowan felt that detail tightened the structure of the case. Emotional shift suggested conflict. Conflict suggested pressure. Pressure suggested someone in her circle had pushed too far. He read Lydia Marr's interview again. Lydia had said she and Mira had different approaches to project planning. Simple words, but the tone conveyed in the written statement had sharp edges. A follow-up question noted Lydia briefly hesitated when asked about the last time she saw Mira. That hesitation, meaningless in 1973, now carried weight. Next, Rowan studied the landlord's maintenance logs. Evan Halter had been inside Mira's home multiple times to fix heating, wiring, and insulation problems. Logs marked with hastily scribbled dates indicated entries. One suspiciously close to the night Mira recorded her tape. If Evan had been inside, he had access. If he had access, he had opportunity. And his receipt from the supply pickup only confirmed a morning return, not his location the night Mira whispered about danger. Rowan then turned to Jonas Riddell's file. The mechanic. The two of them had crossed paths frequently. He had visited her place. He had worked at the industrial depot she photographed. And the blurred silhouette in her depot photo, as well as the Polaroid's partial sleeve, could easily align with someone familiar with industrial uniforms. Rowan studied the photo once more. 3 stripes on the cuff. Not decorative. Workwear. Jonas wore such gear at his job. Evan's maintenance clothing sometimes included similar designs, but Calder, the lecturer, did not wear such attire. Lydia did not either. 2 possible connections, small, logical. Rowan kept reading. Another clue surfaced. Mira had missed a scheduled meeting with her professor the day before she died. She had left behind a note on his door that read only, "Reschedule." Something urgent came up. The handwriting looked rushed, unlike her usual careful script. Unease in writing mirrored unease in voice. Rowan wrote the word pattern in his notebook. He returned to the audio tape. Myra's voice had a particular shape, not panicked, not fearful, but quietly strained, as though she was speaking to someone she trusted enough to let into her home but not enough to feel safe with. Her words, "not safe tonight," suggested she anticipated something, that she expected someone, and that the person she was speaking to wasn't the threat but the witness to it. Someone was watching, someone was approaching, someone she didn't want there. Emotion and logic linked now. Myra's tension, Jonas's unverified late-night presence, Lydia's strained academic rivalry, Evan's unexplained gap, Calder's oversight. Each thread carried its own weight, but some threads felt warmer, more alive. Rowan considered each person not as a suspect, but as a variable in a precise, controlled equation. He let the fragments align themselves. Isolated facts became clues. Clues became patterns. Patterns became structure. And slowly, the emotional undertones behind those patterns began to surface. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. Rowan approached the evidence with the same cold steadiness he had carried for years, refusing to let expectation guide him. He began by eliminating the obvious. Jonas, despite overlapping details, had an inconsistency. His past work uniform did include striped cuffs, but the depot he once worked at had closed before Myra began her photography series. The silhouette in the depot photo was too recent to be him. Next, he cross-referenced heating repair schedules. Evan, the landlord, had been inside Myra's home often. Too often, perhaps. But old property logs revealed something else. Evan had logged a repair at an entirely different location on the same evening Myra recorded her tape. The handwriting was undeniably his, and that location was miles away. He could have returned later, but the heater switch evidence suggested someone who understood Myra's routines intimately. Evan, despite access, felt less aligned with the emotional tension in Myra's final hours. Lydia, protective of her academic work, carried possible motive, but her alibi stood firm. Multiple individuals recalled her presence late into the night. No gap wide enough for the window Myra warned about, and Lydia lacked any direct connection to the industrial areas Myra photographed. Calder, the lecturer, had no reason to enter her home, no reason to hide evidence. His seminar location remained unchanged. His connection to Myra's project was intellectual, not personal. His alibi clean, his motives minimal. That left one person Rowan had initially pushed aside, not because they appeared innocent, but because they were too peripheral, too quiet in the original reports. A neighbor. Mrs. Caroline Hask, the elderly woman who reported the dark car. She had been interviewed briefly and then dismissed due to age, limited mobility, and vague memory. But her statement included one detail that suddenly mattered. She had described the sleeve of the person she saw walking near Myra's window that night as dark with lines on it. Investigators had assumed she meant something decorative. They had overlooked the precision of someone elderly but observant. Lines, not patterns. Stripes. Rowan re-examined her file. Mrs. Hask had a son. A son who visited often. A son who worked in industrial manufacturing. A son whose uniform included 3 narrow stripes on the sleeve. His name had been included only as a footnote. Relative visited occasionally. No one had interviewed him. No one had followed up. No one had considered him relevant. His name, Corwin Hask. Rowan tightened the grip on the Polaroid. The hand in the frame, its posture, the slight inward bend of the wrist, the positioning near the chair. aligned perfectly with the description of Corwin's old workplace posture shown in an employment photo Rowan found through archival search. Corwin had been quiet, almost invisible in the original records. But invisibility was not innocence. As Rowan pieced together the final alignment, a logic-driven chill settled around him. Not fear, not shock, just the realization of something that had been waiting for 50 years to be seen. The least suspected person wasn't the loudest, nor the closest, nor the most contentious. It was the one no one bothered to ask. The clarity did not arrive cleanly. It never did. Rowan sat in the cold stillness of the original crime scene, the faint hum of the building settling around him as he arranged the final pieces of the case in the same deliberate order he'd used for every step since reopening it. The photo, the transcript, the half-finished roll of film, the positions of the suspects, each element rested quietly on the metal table, forming a line of truth that had existed for 50 years without reaching the surface. He felt no satisfaction in locating the pattern, only a muted confirmation, as if the case itself had been waiting for a patient listener. Corwin Hask, a nearly forgotten name. Rowan reviewed the small file again, every detail marked by its own thin thread of significance. A young man in his 20s at the time, employed at an industrial plant where uniforms were standardized, dark material, 3 stripes at the cuff. He had visited his elderly mother often, helping her with groceries and small repairs. She had lived a short walk from Mira Elling's home. She had been the only neighbor who noticed the dark car, the only neighbor who saw someone near the window at night, and the only person whose statement had been dismissed quickly because of her age. In her original testimony, she had said something else, something buried under a brief handwritten note. He said he'd check on the young lady, said she looked troubled lately. The he had been her son, and investigators then had taken the remark as casual concern. Rowan let that detail sink into place, soft, logical, unmistakable. He took a slow breath, studying the air as dust drifted across the faint beam from his flashlight. He thought about Myra's tape, the voice familiar with the person present, the warning whispered with a quiet strain. Not safe tonight. She had not been speaking to a stranger. She had been speaking to someone who was not the danger but knew the danger existed. Someone aware of Corwin's presence near her home. Someone who understood she felt watched. It wasn't Jonas or Lydia or Evan. It wasn't Calder. The overlooked detail rested in a single unnoticed sentence, spoken by an elderly woman whose memory had been underestimated. Corwin had visited her frequently. He had access to her home. She had keys hung on a hook near her door, keys he could borrow without her noticing. If Myra had felt unsettled, Corwin could have approached under the guise of checking on her. And if he had known she was alone, or vulnerable, or anxious from her recent project, he might have used that opportunity. Rowan didn't imagine the scene in the dramatic sense. He reconstructed it the way investigators do, with controlled precision, no embellishment. Corwin knocks. Myra hesitates, but she opens the door because she recognizes him. They talk. Something shifts. Maybe he develops an interest she does not reciprocate. Maybe she expresses concern about being watched, unintentionally revealing her fear to someone misinterpreting it. Or maybe Corwin, stepping into her home under an innocent pretext, sees the Polaroid camera on her table, the photographs she has been taking, the industrial depot where she had been spending her afternoons, a place where he sometimes spent time alone. Whatever the motive, it wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. Small tensions, quiet misunderstandings, or an intrusive personality amplified by solitude. And in the stillness of Myra's home, something turned. The heater clicked off. The window cracked open. The silence fell, heavy and deliberate. Rowan didn't imagine violence. The case required no graphic details. He imagined only the cold, the stillness, the way Myra might have realized too late that the person she had allowed inside shifted from familiar to unwelcome. A subtle boundary crossed. A breath held too long. A single, devastating misjudgment. Truth didn't need spectacle. It needed alignment. Rowan examined the Polaroid again. The sleeve, the stripes, the posture, Corwin's stance in the employment photo mirrored it exactly. A small detail, quiet as breath, powerful as logic. He opened the final archived note found in the misfiled evidence box, a partial photograph of Myra's living room taken from a low angle. Rowan studied the furniture, the arrangement, the shadows. Something subtle stood out, an object half visible behind the chair. A small, rectangular item, the missing notebook. Not stolen, not destroyed, simply misplaced in the chaos of the scene. Corwin had likely picked it up, perhaps glancing through it, perhaps irritated by the faces and places she photographed. A moment of intrusion mistaken for curiosity. A moment that altered the course of a life. Rowan closed the notebook gently. Its thin pages carried no dramatic secrets, only schedules, location notes, and the outline of a project she never finished. He leaned back, the chair groaning softly beneath him. His hands remained still on the table, fingers lightly touching the edges of the evidence. In the dim room, his silhouette merged with the lingering outlines from decades before. He didn't feel triumph. He never did in cases like this. The truth was not a revelation. It was a correction. He wrote his final assessment with the same clinical steadiness that had guided him through the reopening. His words were concise, stripped of emotion, shaped only by fact. Primary responsible individual, Corwin Hask. Evidence consistent with presence on December 3, 1973. Photographic confirmation. Audio context indicates victim's prior knowledge of risk. Case outcome likely centered on proximity, opportunity, and personal interaction. He closed the file. The sound was soft, muted by age, but it carried a small finality. Not closure, just acknowledgement. He stood and surveyed the room one last time. The empty walls held faint outlines of where photographs had once hung. Old tape residue clung to the corners like artifacts of a forgotten language. The cold air pressed lightly against his skin. And in that stillness, Rowan felt the soft weight of a truth too late to help, too faint to punish, but necessary nonetheless. He packed the materials carefully, placing each piece exactly where it belonged. Order in place of disorder. Precision where there had been neglect. Logic where emotion had once clouded judgment. Before turning off his flashlight, he allowed himself a brief, quiet thought. Not sentiment, not sorrow, just a reflection shaped by the emptiness of the room. Some truths take decades to rise. Some remain buried because they demand patience few possess. Some appear only when someone chooses to see what was always there. Rowan stepped toward the doorway, the wooden floor creaking beneath his steady stride. He paused in the threshold and looked back once more at the ghost of a crime scene now finally understood. Justice in its mechanical form had been served, not loudly, not dramatically. A box filled, a name written, a conclusion reached, procedure complete. Yet human truth, what Myra feared, what Corwin wanted, what silence swallowed, remained suspended somewhere beyond any file or evidence log. Rowan switched off the light. The room fell back into darkness, the way it had waited for 50 years. The dust settled again. The cold air eased into its old rhythm. The memory of Mira Elling lingered not as a solved mystery, but as a quiet reminder. Truth, he realized, wasn't always found in the center of a case. Sometimes it lived in the margins, in the overlooked sentences, in the subtle shadows no one bothered to illuminate. And as he closed the door behind him, he understood something simple, quiet, unresolvable. Justice may follow rules, but truth hides in silence.